The desert wind howled through the canyons like a wounded animal, carrying with it the taste of dust and despair. Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of her property, one hand shielding her eyes from the relentless sun, the other gripping the weathered fence post that marked the boundary between her land and the vast, unforgiving wilderness beyond. The year was 1873, and the Arizona Territory had never felt more hostile. Her small wooden house, built by her late husband's hands, creaked and groaned under the assault of another sandstorm brewing in the distance. The structure wasn't much, 4 rooms cobbled together with whatever timber Thomas had managed to haul from the distant mountains. But it was home, or what remained of home after the Apache raid had taken Thomas from her 8 months ago. Margaret's calloused fingers traced the grain of the fence post, remembering how Thomas had driven it into the hard earth, sweat dripping from his brow as he declared, "This'll be our kingdom, Maggie, small, but ours." Now it was just hers, and the kingdom felt more like a prison of solitude. The storm arrived faster than expected, forcing her inside. She secured the shutters and lit the oil lamp, its warm glow barely pushing back the darkness that seemed to press against the windows. In the corner, Thomas's rifle still leaned against the wall, untouched since that terrible day. She couldn't bring herself to move it, just as she couldn't bring herself to sleep in their bed. Most nights found her dozing fitfully in the rocking chair by the cold fireplace. It was near dawn when the storm finally passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Margaret ventured out to check the well and assess any damage to the chicken coop. The desert had been transformed overnight. Sand dunes had shifted, creating new landscapes where familiar paths once lay. It was while navigating these changed terrains that she heard it, a sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind through the rocks. A child's whimper. Margaret froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew she should retreat to the house, grab Thomas's rifle, and bolt the door. Apache warriors might be using children as bait. It wouldn't be the first time, but something in that sound, perhaps its very weakness, pulled her forward, behind a cluster of sagebrush and tumbled rocks. She found them, 4 little girls, the oldest perhaps 7 years old, huddled together like a litter of abandoned puppies. Their doe-skin dresses were torn and filthy, their faces gaunt with hunger and streaked with tears that had long since dried. They were Apache, no mistaking those features, and they were dying. The smallest one, barely more than a toddler, lay limp in the oldest girl's arms. The older child looked up at Margaret with eyes that held too much knowledge for her years, eyes that expected death but still flickered with the tiniest spark of hope. Margaret's hands trembled as she knelt beside them. Every lesson she'd learned about survival in the territory screamed at her to walk away. These were Apache children, the offspring of the very people who had made her a widow, the same tribe that had burned the Hendricks Ranch to the ground just last month. Taking them in would mark her as a traitor to her own kind. But as she looked at their small, desperate faces, all she could see were children, hungry, frightened, abandoned children who would die without help. "Water," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "You need water." The oldest girl seemed to understand. She tried to stand but collapsed immediately, her legs too weak to support even her slight weight. Margaret didn't think, she simply acted. She scooped up the smallest child, shocked at how light she was, like holding a bird with hollow bones. The child's head lolled against her shoulder, and Margaret could feel the fever radiating through the thin fabric of her dress. "Come," she said to the others, gesturing toward her house. "Come." It took 3 trips to get them all inside. Margaret's back ached and her arms trembled from the effort, but she managed to carry each child to safety. She laid them on the floor near the fireplace and immediately set about building a fire, heating water, and gathering what little food she had. The children watched her warily, even in their weakened state. The oldest girl kept trying to position herself between Margaret and the younger ones, a protector even when she could barely lift her head. Margaret moved slowly, deliberately. The way Thomas had taught her to approach spooked horses. She started with water, just a few drops at a time on cracked lips, Then thin gruel made from her precious store of cornmeal. The children were too weak to resist, and gradually, as sustenance entered their bodies, some life returned to their eyes. It wasn't until she was tending to the smallest one's fever that Margaret heard the approaching horses. Her blood ran cold. 3 riders were coming down the trail from town. She recognized Jake Morrison's distinctive gray mare even at a distance. There was no time to hide the children. Margaret could only straighten her spine and step onto the porch as the men drew near. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan." Jake tipped his hat, but his eyes were cold. "Heard tell you might have had some visitors." "I don't know what you've heard, Mr. Morrison, but as you can see, I'm quite alone." The lie came easier than she expected. "That's so." Jake's companion, a rough-looking man Margaret didn't recognize, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Because Will Garrett swears he saw you carrying something into your house early this morning. Something that looked mighty like an Apache brat." "Mr. Garrett's eyesight isn't what it used to be," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Perhaps he saw me bringing in supplies before the storm." Jake dismounted, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "Mind if we have a look inside, just to put folks' minds at ease?" "I do mind, actually." Margaret positioned herself firmly in the doorway. "This is my property, Mr. Morrison. My husband died defending it, and I'll not have strangers tramping through his home on the basis of gossip." The third man, silent until now, leaned forward in his saddle. "Harboring Apache is a hanging offense in some parts. Ma'am, you sure you want to take that stance?" Margaret's knees threatened to buckle, but she held firm. "I'm sure I want you off my land. Good day, gentlemen." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Jake Morrison smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "We'll be back, Mrs. Sullivan, with more men and a warrant from the town council. I suggest you think real hard about where your loyalties lie." They rode away in a cloud of dust, and only then did Margaret allow herself to sag against the doorframe. She knew they'd make good on their threat. The town council would side with Jake. They always did. She had perhaps a day, maybe 2, before they returned in force. Inside, she found the oldest girl trying to stand again, fear written plainly on her face. She'd understood enough. Margaret knelt beside her, gently pressing her back down. "Rest," she said softly. "Just rest." But even as she spoke the soothing words, Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't fight off a mob, couldn't protect these children if the whole town turned against her. Yet looking at them, at their hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, she knew she couldn't turn them out either. The smallest one whimpered in her sleep, and Margaret instinctively reached out to smooth her hair. Such a simple gesture, one she'd dreamed of giving her own children someday. The children she and Thomas would never have now. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, baking the desert floor until it shimmered with heat, Margaret Sullivan made her choice. She would keep these children safe, no matter the cost. The town could call her a traitor. They could threaten and rage and cast her out. But she would not, could not, turn away from the desperate souls who had found their way to her door. She spent the rest of the day fortifying what she could, moving the children to the root cellar where they'd be safer if trouble came, and preparing what defenses she could manage. As night fell, she sat by lamplight, Thomas's rifle across her knees, and waited. The children slept fitfully in the cellar below, occasionally crying out in languages she didn't understand. Each sound tore at her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, Margaret Sullivan's house didn't feel empty. It felt like home, a complicated, dangerous, unlikely home, but home nonetheless. The first week tested Margaret in ways she never imagined. The children, she'd learned their names through patient repetition and gestures, required constant care. Ayana, the eldest at 7, watched Margaret's every move with dark, suspicious eyes. Nayeli, perhaps 5, clung to Ayana like a shadow. The twins, Soyala and Kaya, were maybe 3 years old, identical except for a small scar on Kaya's chin. Margaret's meager supplies dwindled rapidly. 4 growing children consumed food at an alarming rate, even when that food was little more than watered-down porridge and the occasional egg from her struggling chickens. She'd already butchered one of her 3 remaining hens, knowing she couldn't afford to, but unable to watch the children's haunted, hungry faces any longer. The morning of the 8th day brought a new crisis. Kaya woke burning with fever, her small body racked with coughs that sounded like breaking branches. Margaret had no medicine save for a small bottle of willow bark tea, and that was nearly gone. She needed supplies, but going to town meant leaving the children alone and facing the hostile stares of her neighbors. Ayana must have sensed her dilemma. The girl approached cautiously, pointed to herself, then to the younger children, and made a gesture that clearly meant, "I watch." Her eyes held a solemnity that no 7-year-old should possess. "You'll keep them safe?" Margaret asked, knowing the girl couldn't understand her words but hoping she'd grasp the meaning. Ayana nodded once, firmly. The ride to town felt like entering enemy territory. Margaret kept her bonnet low and her eyes down, but she could feel the weight of stares as she hitched her old mare outside Henderson's general store. The usual chatter died as she entered. Mrs. Henderson, who had once shared recipes with Margaret at church socials, now looked through her as if she were invisible. "We're near out of most things," the woman said coldly, though Margaret could clearly see full shelves behind her. "I need cornmeal, beans, and medicine for fever," Margaret said quietly. "I have money." "Your money's no good here." This from Robert Callahan, the blacksmith, who stood near the counter with arms crossed. "Not when you're using it to feed Apache whelps." Margaret's hands clenched around her small purse. "They're children. Mr. Callahan. Sick children. They're Apache." He spat. "Same as killed the Hendricks family. Same as killed your own husband, though you seem to have forgotten that quick enough." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Margaret's vision blurred with sudden tears, but she blinked them back. "I haven't forgotten anything, but these aren't the ones who—" "Don't matter which ones," interrupted Samuel Wright. "The town's self-appointed moral guardian. Apache is Apache. You take their side, you're no better than them." A small crowd had gathered now, their faces hard with righteousness. Margaret recognized each one, people she'd shared Sunday dinners with, helped during harvest time, comforted through losses. Now they looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, a traitor. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "Just the medicine. A child is dying. Let it die." The harsh words came from behind her. She turned to find Jake Morrison lounging in the doorway, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. One less savage to grow up and murder decent folk. Something inside Margaret snapped. The meek submission she'd worn like armor these past days fell away, replaced by a cold fury. Is that what we are now? People who celebrate the death of children? Who Christ himself said to suffer the little children to come unto him? Did he specify only certain children? The religious reference made some shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Pemberton, the minister's wife, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Don't you dare quote scripture at us," Samuel Wright snarled. "Not while you're harboring the devil's own spawn." Margaret straightened her spine. "Then I'll take my business elsewhere. But know this, when you stand before the Almighty and he asks what mercy you showed to the least of these, what will you answer?" She turned to leave, but Jake Morrison blocked her path. "You ain't going nowhere else, widow woman. We sent word to all the towns hereabout. Nobody's selling to Apache lovers." The trap closed around her like a noose. No supplies, no medicine, no hope of getting what the children needed to survive. Margaret's mind raced, searching for options, finding none. It was then that Eduardo Santana, the Mexican trader who ran a small shop at the edge of town, stepped forward. The crowd parted reluctantly to let him through. He'd faced his own share of prejudice and usually kept his head down. But now he looked directly at Margaret. "I have some old cornmeal in the back," he said quietly. "Beans, too. Not much, but—" He shrugged, a gesture that said volumes about the risk he was taking. "You sell to her. You're cut off too." "Santana," Jake warned. Eduardo's dark eyes flashed. "Then I suppose I am cut off." He gestured for Margaret to follow him. The transaction was quick and wordless. Eduardo wouldn't take her money. Just pressed a sack of supplies into her hands, along with a small bottle of medicine he pulled from beneath his counter. "For the fever," he murmured. "My grandmother's recipe." Margaret's throat was too tight for words. She could only nod her gratitude before hurrying out the back way, the crowd's hostile mutters following her into the street. The ride home felt endless. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Every sound might herald pursuit. But she made it back to find Ayanna had indeed kept watch, though the girl nearly collapsed with relief when Margaret walked through the door. Kaya's fever had worsened. Margaret immediately set about brewing the medicine Eduardo had given her, praying it would help. As she worked, Ayanna surprised her by beginning to help, fetching water, keeping the twins occupied, even attempting to cool her sister's fever with a damp cloth. They worked in companionable silence, two females united in the ancient task of nursing the sick. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself talking softly, knowing Ayanna couldn't understand but needing to fill the silence. "My mother used to make a tea like this," she said, crushing herbs with Thomas's old mortar and pestle. "Said her mother learned it from a traveling woman, though we never knew where she came from originally." She glanced at Ayanna, who watched intently. "Maybe she knew your people. Maybe this medicine has traveled full circle." By evening, Kaya's fever had broken. She was weak but lucid, accepting small sips of broth with something approaching appetite. The twins, sensing the easing of tension, began to play quietly with some wooden spoons Margaret had given them. It was then, in that moment of fragile peace, that Margaret heard the horses again. Many horses this time. Her blood ran cold as she peered through the window to see at least a dozen riders approaching, Jake Morrison at their head. "Into the cellar," she said urgently, gesturing to Ayanna. The girl understood immediately, gathering her sisters with remarkable efficiency. Within moments, they disappeared into the root cellar's darkness. Margaret had barely dropped the trapdoor's rug back into place when the pounding started. "Open up, Mrs. Sullivan. Town council's orders." She opened the door to find herself facing not just Jake and his cronies, but also Judge Patterson, the closest thing their small community had to legal authority. His presence meant this was official. "Ma'am," the judge said, tipping his hat with apparent reluctance. "We've had reports of you harboring fugitive Apache children. I'm here to investigate those claims." "And if the claims prove true," Margaret asked, though she knew the answer, "then the children will be removed and taken to the proper authorities, and you'll face charges for aiding hostiles." "I see." Margaret stepped aside. "Then, I suppose, you'd better come in." They ransacked her small home with ruthless efficiency. Bedding was overturned. Cupboards emptied. Even the floorboards tested for hollow sounds. All the while, Margaret stood silent, praying the children would remain quiet below. It was young Tom Morrison, Jake's son, who noticed the cellar. "Pa, there's a rug here that's been moved recent-like. See the dust marks?" Margaret's heart stopped. Jake's face lit with triumph as he bent to pull away the rug, revealing the trap door beneath. Well, what have we here?" "My root cellar," Margaret said calmly, "where I store preserves and potatoes. Let's just have a look, shall we?" Jake yanked open the door and descended, followed by several others. Margaret heard their boots on the wooden steps, heard them moving through the small space below. Her hands clenched so tightly, her nails bit into her palms. Long moments passed. Then Jake emerged, his face thunderous. "Nothing," he snarled. "Nothing but preserves and potatoes, just like she said." Margaret nearly fainted with relief. Somehow, impossibly, the children had hidden themselves. But how? The cellar was small, with nowhere to— "Check again," someone demanded. "They could be hiding behind the shelves." Another search, more thorough this time. Still nothing. The men emerged dusty and frustrated. Jake's face growing redder by the moment. "They're here somewhere," he insisted. "I know it." Judge Patterson raised a hand. "That's enough. Morrison, we've searched thoroughly and found nothing. Mrs. Sullivan, I apologize for the intrusion. This ain't over," Jake hissed as the group filed out. "I'll be watching. One slip, woman. That's all I need." Margaret maintained her composure until the last horse disappeared into the darkness. Only then did she collapse against the door, shaking. After several minutes, she descended to the cellar. "Ayanna?" she called softly. "It's safe now." A section of the wall swung open, a hidden door she'd never known existed, probably built by the home's original owner for storing valuables. 4 small figures emerged from the cramped space, Ayanna leading them with that same fierce protectiveness. Margaret dropped to her knees and, without thinking, pulled them all into an embrace. For a moment, Ayanna stiffened, then slowly, cautiously, relaxed into the hug. The younger ones followed her lead, and suddenly Margaret found herself crying. Great, gulping sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for Thomas, for the children these girls must have lost, for the hatred she'd seen in her neighbors' faces, for the kindness of Eduardo Santana, for the impossible situation that seemed to have no good ending. The children clung to her as she wept, and perhaps they understood more than she thought, because Nayeli began to hum something, a lullaby in her own language that somehow transcended words. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret found Ayanna looking at her with something new in those dark eyes. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. The girl pointed to Margaret, then to herself and her sisters, and finally pressed her small hand over her heart. "Yes," Margaret whispered, understanding. "Yes, little one, you're safe here. No matter what comes, you're safe with me." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the danger was far from over. Jake Morrison wouldn't give up. The town's hostility would only grow. And somewhere out there, whatever tragedy had separated these children from their people might still be searching for them. For now, though, in this moment, they were together, a widow and 4 orphans, bound by circumstance and growing affection. Facing an uncertain future with only each other for comfort, it wasn't much, but it was enough. Margaret rose, wiping her eyes. "Come, let's get you fed and back to bed. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." As she helped the children settle for the night, Ayanna spoke for the first time, a single word in accented English. "Mother?" Margaret's heart clenched. She touched the girl's cheek gently. "If you'll have me," she whispered. Ayanna nodded solemnly, then curled up with her sisters. Within minutes, all 4 were asleep, exhausted by the day's terrors. Margaret sat watching them by candlelight, Thomas's rifle once again across her knees, and wondered what battles tomorrow would bring. The drought came like a thief in the night, stealing what little hope Margaret had managed to nurture. By the 3rd week without rain, the well's water level had dropped alarmingly. The vegetable garden, which she'd counted on to supplement their meager supplies, withered under the relentless sun. Even the hardy desert plants seemed to shrivel and retreat into themselves. Margaret rationed water carefully, but with 5 mouths to drink and bodies to wash, it disappeared at frightening speed. She gave the children priority, often going without herself until her lips cracked and her head swam with dizziness. The last of the chickens had been butchered a week ago, and Eduardo Santana had been true to Jake Morrison's threat. His shop was now closed, the windows boarded, the kind merchant driven from town for his act of compassion. On a particularly brutal morning, with the temperature already climbing past bearable before the sun had fully risen, Nayeli collapsed. The 5-year-old had been listless for days, but Margaret had attributed it to the heat. Now, as she held the girl's burning body, she recognized the signs of severe dehydration and heat sickness. "Water," she croaked to Ayanna, who immediately understood. But when the eldest girl returned from the well, her face told the story before her words could. She held up the bucket, barely 2 inches of muddy liquid sloshed at the bottom. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting despair. They needed water, they needed food, they needed medicine, they needed a miracle. That night, she did something she hadn't done since Thomas died. She prayed, not the formal, proper prayers of Sunday service, but the raw, desperate pleading of a soul pushed to its limits. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, the children sleeping fitfully around her. "I don't ask for myself, but these children, they've suffered enough. If you have any mercy left, show it now." The night passed without relief. Dawn brought more heat, more thirst, more of Nayeli's labored breathing. Margaret knew they had perhaps another day before the situation became truly dire. She was contemplating the unthinkable, approaching town again, begging on her knees if necessary, when Ayanna suddenly grabbed her arm. The girl pointed out the window, her eyes wide. Margaret looked and felt her heart skip. A lone figure on horseback approached across the shimmering desert, leading a pack mule. As he drew closer, she could make out details, tall, lean, with long dark hair held back by a cloth band. An Apache warrior. Margaret's hand went instinctively to Thomas's rifle, but Ayanna shook her head urgently, pressing her palms together in a gesture of peace. The rider stopped well outside rifle range and dismounted, making no threatening moves. He simply stood there, waiting. "Stay inside," Margaret told the children, though she knew only Ayanna would understand. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. The man raised one hand in greeting, then spoke in accented but clear English. "I mean no harm. Then state your business," Margaret called back, trying to keep her voice steady. He gestured to the pack mule. "I bring water, food, medicine." Margaret's suspicious mind immediately wondered if this was a trap, but when she glanced back at Nayeli's fevered form, she knew she had no choice. "Come forward, slowly." He approached with deliberate calm, keeping his hands visible. As he drew near, Margaret could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40 years, with deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. His face was weathered but not unkind. "You care for Apache children," he said. It wasn't a question. "They were dying," Margaret replied simply. He nodded, as if this explanation was sufficient. "I am Joseph." She noticed he used an Anglo name, probably for her benefit. "These children, they are from my brother's band, lost in the raid at Canyon Creek." Margaret's breath caught. She'd heard about Canyon Creek, a brutal clash between cavalry and Apache that had left casualties on both sides. Are you here to take them?" Joseph's gaze moved past her to where small faces peered from the window. His expression softened with unmistakable grief. Their parents walked the spirit path. "I would take them, but..." He gestured to the empty desert. "My people are hunted, scattered. No place for children now." He began unloading the pack mule. Water barrels, sacks of cornmeal and beans, strips of dried meat, and several small leather pouches that smelled of herbs. "You show courage," he said as he worked. "Also foolishness. The white men will not tolerate this." "I know." Margaret watched him pile the supplies on her porch, overwhelmed by the bounty. "Why help us?" Joseph paused in his work. "My woman died in childbirth 3 winters past. Our daughter lived 2 days. His voice carried old pain. "I could not save them. Perhaps I can help save these." He finished unloading and turned to face her fully. "I will come when I can. Leave signs if you need help urgently. White cloth on the fence post, but be careful. The soldiers patrol more frequently now." "Thank you," Margaret said, the words inadequate for what she felt. Joseph moved toward his horse, then stopped. "The eldest, Ayanna, she is my brother's daughter. Tell her..." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Tell her she honors her father's memory with her courage." He mounted and rode away without looking back, disappearing into the heat shimmer like a desert spirit. Margaret stood watching until even the dust of his passage had settled, then hurried inside with the supplies. The water was cool and clean. She immediately gave Nayeli small sips, mixing in some of the medicinal herbs Joseph had left. Within hours, the girl's fever began to break. The other children drank deeply, their bodies soaking up the life-giving liquid like desert flowers after rain. As Margaret prepared a proper meal for the first time in weeks, she told Ayanna about Joseph, about her father. The girl's eyes filled with tears, the first Margaret had seen her shed. But they seemed to be tears of relief as much as grief, as if knowing someone from her world still existed gave her permission to mourn what was lost. That night, with full bellies and plenty of water, the children slept peacefully. Margaret sat by the window, keeping watch, when she noticed lights in the distance, torches, moving in a line toward her property. Her moment of peace shattered. She recognized the deliberate pace, the number of flames. This wasn't a random patrol, this was a mob, and they were coming for her. "Ayanna," she whispered urgently, waking the girl. "Take your sisters to the cellar, to the hidden room, now." The child needed no further explanation. Within moments, she had roused the others and shepherded them below. Margaret heard the hidden door close just as the mob reached her fence line. They didn't bother with pretense this time. Jake Morrison led them, but she counted at least 20 men, some carrying torches, others rifles. They'd been drinking. She could smell the whiskey from her porch. "Last chance. Widow," Jake called out. "Send out them Apache brats, or we'll burn you out." "There are no children here," Margaret shouted back, knowing the lie was futile but needing to try. "We know about the Apache buck what visited today." Another voice called. She recognized it as Pete Garrett, the town drunk. "Saw him myself, unloading supplies. You're consorting with hostiles now." "He brought humanitarian aid," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice reasonable. "Water and food, nothing more." "Humanitarian aid," Jake laughed harshly. "Listen to her, boys, talking like them Eastern do-gooders. Next she'll be telling us the Apache are just misunderstood." The mob pressed closer, some already at her fence. In the torchlight, their faces looked demonic, twisted with hate and alcohol. "Burn her out," someone shouted. Others took up the cry. "Burn the Indian lover." Margaret raised Thomas's rifle, knowing she couldn't fight them all, but determined to try. "First man through my gate gets a bullet." "You won't shoot," Jake sneered. "You ain't got it in you, woman." A torch arced through the air, landing on her roof. The dry wood caught immediately. Another followed, then another. Soon, flames began licking at the edges of her home. Desperation gave Margaret strength. She fired into the air, the rifle's report momentarily silencing the mob. The next shot won't be a warning, but they knew she was bluffing. Even if she could bring herself to kill, she had one rifle against 20 men. The fire was spreading, smoke beginning to fill the air. She thought of the children trapped below, of the promise she'd made to keep them safe. It was then that thunder rolled across the desert. Everyone froze, looking up at the cloudless sky in confusion. The thunder came again, but now Margaret recognized it. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Approaching fast. Out of the darkness rode a dozen Apache warriors, Joseph at their head. They didn't attack, didn't even raise weapons. They simply formed a line between the mob and Margaret's burning home, their presence a silent threat more powerful than any words. The mob, suddenly faced with an armed Apache instead of one lone woman, lost much of its courage. Men who'd been shouting for blood moments before now backed away, eyes wide with fear. "This ain't your fight, Indians," Jake said, but his voice shook. Joseph nudged his horse forward. "You attack woman who protects Apache children. This makes it our fight. She's harboring your kind illegally. She shows mercy." Joseph's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Something you know nothing about." The standoff stretched taut. Margaret used the distraction to grab buckets, trying desperately to fight the spreading fire. Some of the Apache dismounted to help, forming a bucket brigade from the well. It was Judge Patterson who broke the stalemate. The old man had arrived late, out of breath from riding hard. "That's enough," he shouted. "Everyone stand down. Judge, you can't—" Jake started. "I can, and I will." Patterson's rarely used authority rang out. This is still a territory of laws, not mob rule. Any man who commits violence here tonight will answer to the federal marshal. That includes you, Morrison." The judge turned to Joseph. "And you, sir, while I appreciate your intervention, I must ask you to withdraw. Your presence here only inflames tensions." Joseph looked to Margaret, who nodded gratefully. The fire was under control, the damage minimal thanks to their quick action. "We go," he said simply. "But we watch. Harm come to this woman or children. We return." The Apache melted back into the darkness as silently as they'd come. The mob, deprived of their easy target and sobered by the near confrontation, began to disperse. Jake Morrison was the last to leave, his face twisted with impotent rage. "This ain't over," he promised. Not by a long shot. When they were finally alone, Margaret released the children from their hiding place. They emerged wide-eyed and frightened, naively clinging to Ayanna's hand. The smell of smoke made them cough, but they were unharmed. Margaret gathered them close, her own hands shaking with delayed reaction. They'd survived another night, but at what cost? The town now knew she had Apache protection, which would only increase the hostility, and Joseph's people had taken a terrible risk revealing themselves. As she settled the children back to sleep, keeping all the windows open to clear the smoke, Margaret wondered how long this unsustainable situation could continue. She was walking a knife's edge between two worlds that seemed destined to destroy each other, with 4 innocent lives hanging in the balance. Outside, she thought she glimpsed movement in the darkness, a lone figure keeping watch, Joseph, or one of his men, making good on their promise to protect. The thought brought comfort and worry in equal measure. The drought might have broken, metaphorically if not literally, but Margaret knew the storm was far from over. If anything, the stakes had just been raised. The next move in this dangerous game would come soon, and she could only pray she'd be ready for it. The morning after the fire, Joseph returned alone. Margaret watched him approach from her damaged porch, noting how he sat his horse with the easy grace of one born to the saddle. The children, who had been helping her clear debris, stopped their work to stare. Ayanna's face transformed with something between joy and sorrow at seeing someone from her world. He dismounted at a respectful distance and waited. Margaret understood the courtesy. After last night's violence, he wouldn't assume welcome. She stepped down from the porch, meeting him halfway. "Thank you," she said simply, "for last night." Joseph inclined his head. "The children, they are well?" "Yes, thanks to you and your men." Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Why did you risk so much? Your people are already hunted, revealing yourselves. Some things matter more than safety." His dark eyes moved past her to where the children clustered in the doorway. "May I speak with them?" Margaret nodded, stepping aside. Joseph approached slowly, then lowered himself to sit cross-legged in the dust, bringing himself to the children's level. He spoke in Apache, his voice gentle. Ayanna responded hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The younger ones gradually crept closer, drawn by the familiar cadences of their mother tongue. Margaret watched the exchange, understanding nothing of the words but everything of the emotion. These children had been severed from their culture, their language, their very identity. Joseph was offering them a bridge back, however temporary. After several minutes, Joseph reached into his pouch and withdrew something, a small wooden doll, crudely carved but precious. He handed it to Soyala, who clutched it to her chest with wide eyes. For Kaya, he produced a leather cord with a small turquoise stone. Nayeli received a tiny, woven basket, no bigger than a walnut. For Ayanna, he had something wrapped in soft doe skin. The eldest girl unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver hair ornament that made her gasp. She looked up at Joseph with tears streaming down her face. Clutching the ornament, clearly a family heirloom, with trembling hands, Joseph spoke again, and though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she heard the weight of ceremony in them. He was giving these children more than gifts. He was giving them pieces of their heritage to carry forward. When he finally stood, Margaret saw the effort it cost him to leave. He faced her, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty in his weathered features. "I must ask something," he said, the English words coming slowly, as if he were choosing each one with care. "There is another child." Margaret's heart lurched. "Another?" "A boy, very small, maybe 2 winters." Joseph's jaw tightened. "His mother was my sister. She died protecting him from soldiers. The boy lives, but—" He trailed off, gazing toward the mountains. Margaret waited, sensing the weight of what he wasn't saying. "My people scatter to survive," he finally continued. "No one band can take another mouth to feed, especially one so young. The women who might care for him have their own children to worry about. And a boy child." He shook his head. "Soldiers see future warrior. They shoot first, even babies." The request hung unspoken between them. Margaret looked at the 4 girls, already stretching her resources to the breaking point. Another child, a toddler requiring constant care, would make their situation even more precarious. And yet, where is he now? She heard herself asking. Hope flickered in Joseph's eyes. "With my cousin, 3 days north, but she cannot keep him much longer. Her husband says the risk is too great." Margaret thought of the mob last night, of Jake Morrison's twisted face, of her dwindling supplies and the town's hostility. Then she looked at Ayanna, who had clearly understood the conversation despite the language barrier. The girl's eyes pleaded silently. "Bring him," Margaret said quietly. "God help me, bring him." Joseph's composure cracked slightly, revealing profound relief. "You are," he searched for words. "More than we hoped." "I'm a fool," Margaret corrected, but without heat. "When?" 3 days. I must travel carefully." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "This kindness will not be forgotten, but it will bring more danger. The town already wants me hanged or burned out. One more child won't change that." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "You have warrior's heart," he said finally. "Your husband was fortunate man." The unexpected reference to Thomas caught Margaret off guard. He would have understood. I think, despite everything, then he was wise man too. Joseph swung onto his horse. 3 days. Watch for me at sunset." He rode away, and Margaret turned to find all 4 girls clustered around her. Ayanna took her hand, squeezing gently. The gesture said more than words could have. "Well," Margaret said, attempting lightness she didn't feel, "we'd better prepare for a baby." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret repaired what damage she could from the fire, reinforced the hidden room in the cellar, and tried to stretch their supplies to accommodate another mouth. The children helped with touching eagerness, especially Ayanna, who seemed to have appointed herself Margaret's assistant in all things. On the 2nd day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mrs. Catherine Holbrook, the minister's wife who had remained silent during the confrontation at the store. She rode up in her modest buggy, looking nervous but determined. Margaret met her with wary courtesy. "Mrs. Holbrook, Margaret." The older woman climbed down, clutching a large basket. I've come to apologize." Margaret blinked in surprise. Of all the things she'd expected, this wasn't among them. "May I come in?" Catherine asked. "Please, I have some things for the children." Against her better judgment, Margaret allowed it. Catherine entered hesitantly, her eyes widening at the sight of the 4 Apache girls working industriously at various tasks. Ayanna mending, Nayeli grinding corn, the twins playing quietly with their new treasures from Joseph. "My word," Catherine breathed. "They're just children." "Yes," Margaret said dryly. "Just children." Catherine flushed. "I've been a coward. We all have. When Jake Morrison speaks, we all just go along. But last night, when I heard about the fire, about what almost happened..." She unpacked her basket with shaking hands. Bread, preserves, a precious jar of honey, and wrapped in tissue, 4 small dresses. "These were my Emma's," she said softly. She outgrew them years ago, but I kept them. I thought, well, children need proper clothes. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Catherine, this is... But won't your husband... Samuel doesn't know I'm here. And if he finds out... Catherine straightened her shoulders. Then perhaps it's time I remembered that I answer to a higher authority than my husband or Jake Morrison. She stayed for an hour, helping Margaret alter the dresses to fit and sharing what news she could from town. The mob action had divided opinions. Some supported Jake, but others were disturbed by how close they'd come to murder. Judge Patterson read everyone the riot act at Sunday service. Catherine reported. Said we were one step away from becoming the kind of lawless heathens we claim to stand against. As she prepared to leave, Catherine pressed Margaret's hand. I'll come again when I can. And Margaret, you're not as alone as you think. Some of us remember what Christianity actually means. After she left, Margaret sat in stunned silence. One ally in town. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. The third evening arrived with a spectacular sunset painting the desert in shades of fire. Margaret had the children fed and ready for bed early, knowing Joseph would wait for full darkness. She kept watch from the porch, Thomas's rifle beside her out of habit more than real expectation of trouble. He materialized from the shadows so quietly she almost missed him. This time he wasn't alone. A woman rode beside him, a small bundle in her arms. They approached slowly, and Margaret went out to meet them. The woman was young, exhausted, with a hollow look of someone who'd known too much hardship. She clutched the bundle, the child, as if afraid to let go. Joseph dismounted and helped the woman down. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing between the bundle and Margaret. Joseph translated quietly. She asks many times if you are certain. She says the boy is difficult, cries often, does not sleep well. She fears he will be too much trouble. All babies are trouble, Margaret said gently, holding out her arms. May I? The woman hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the bundle. The child revealed was indeed small for 2 years, with a shock of black hair and enormous dark eyes that regarded Margaret solemnly. He was thin, too thin, but alert. Margaret took him carefully, feeling his slight weight. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed as she swayed gently, instinctively falling into the eternal rhythm of comfort. What's his name? She asked. Karuk, Joseph said. It means bear in our language, but perhaps you will give him another name, for safety. Margaret looked down at the solemn little face. Samuel, she said softly. I'll call him Samuel. Sam. The irony of naming him after Catherine's rigid husband wasn't lost on her, but somehow it felt right. A small rebellion, a hope for change. The woman spoke again, tears running down her face. Joseph didn't translate, but Margaret understood. The universal language of a mother's grief needed no words. I'll take care of him, Margaret promised. He'll be loved. He'll be safe as I can make him. The exchange was quick after that. The woman kissed the boy's forehead one last time, whispered something that sounded like a blessing or a prayer, and turned away. Joseph helped her mount, but before they left, he pressed another pouch into Margaret's hands. Medicine, he said, for the baby cough he sometimes has, and this... He produced a small leather bag on a cord. His medicine bundle. When he is older, it will tell him who he is. They disappeared into the darkness, leaving Margaret standing in her yard with a 2-year-old Apache boy in her arms. Little Sam, Karuk, watched her with those serious eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling he understood more than a child his age should. Well, she murmured, let's go meet your sisters. The girls were awake despite the late hour, sensing something momentous. When Margaret entered with Sam, Ayanna immediately came forward, her face bright with recognition and joy. She spoke to the boy in Apache, her tone gentle and welcoming. To Margaret's surprise, it was Nayeli who claimed him next, taking him from Margaret's arms with confident care that spoke of experience with younger siblings. The twins pressed close, fascinated by this new addition to their strange family, as Margaret watched them cluster around the boy, touching his hair, offering him bits of food, chattering in their language. She felt a shift in the room's dynamics. They were no longer four lost girls clinging to survival. They were siblings now, a unit, a family forged by circumstances but bound by something stronger. Sam's solemn expression finally cracked when Kaya offered him her precious doll to examine. A tiny smile tugged at his mouth, and when he laughed, a rusty sound as if he'd almost forgotten how, all the girls joined in. Margaret sank into her chair, exhausted but oddly at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. 5 Apache children instead of 4 would only inflame the town's anger further. Supplies would be even more stretched. The danger would multiply. But tonight, watching these children find joy in each other despite everything they'd lost, she knew she'd made the only choice her heart would allow. Joseph was right. She did have a warrior's heart. She just fought different battles than most. As she finally herded them all to bed, a complex operation with Sam clinging to Nele and refusing to be separated, Margaret offered up another prayer to the desert stars. "Thomas," she whispered, "I hope you understand. I hope you'd be proud." The wind through the damaged roof might have been an answer, or just the desert's eternal voice. Either way, Margaret chose to take it as approval. She had 5 children to raise now, a town full of enemies, and uncertain allies at best. But she also had something she hadn't possessed since Thomas died: purpose. These children needed her, and perhaps more surprisingly, she needed them. Together, they would face whatever came next. The desert night settled around the small house, and for the first time in many months, it felt less like a prison and more like a home. The town meeting was called for the first Saturday in October, held in the small church that doubled as a courthouse when Judge Patterson presided. Margaret knew she would be the main topic of discussion. Catherine Holbrook had warned her 3 days prior, slipping away from her husband to deliver the news along with another basket of provisions. "They mean to force you out," Catherine had said, wringing her hands. "Jake Morrison has been stirring everyone up, saying you're a threat to the community's safety, that harboring Apache children makes you complicit in their raids." Margaret had received the news calmly. Though her heart raced, she'd known this day would come. The past weeks had seen a steady escalation of hostilities. Dead chickens thrown over her fence, her well poisoned with lye, thankfully discovered before anyone drank, and constant surveillance by Morrison's men. Now, standing before the assembled townspeople with her 5 children, Margaret held her head high despite the weight of their stares. She'd dressed the children in their best, the dresses Catherine had provided for the girls, and for little Sam, a small suit she'd fashioned from one of Thomas's old shirts. They stood close to her, Ayanna holding Sam's hand while the twins pressed against Margaret's skirts. Judge Patterson called for order, his gavel sharp against the makeshift bench. "This meeting has been called to address concerns about Mrs. Margaret Sullivan's harboring of Apache children and the danger this poses to our community." Jake Morrison was on his feet immediately. "Danger is putting it mildly. Judge, this woman has brought the enemy right into our midst. Just last month, the Apache attacked the stage line not 30 miles from here. How do we know these brats ain't spying for their people?" "They're children," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "The oldest is 7 years old. Nits make lice." Someone called from the back. Margaret couldn't see who. "Today they're children. Tomorrow they're savages killing our families." "Like they killed my husband?" Margaret asked quietly, and the room fell silent. "Yes, Apache warriors killed Thomas, and I grieved. I still grieve. But these children didn't kill him. They were starving to death when I found them. What would you have had me do? Step over their bodies and continue on?" "Yes." Jake Morrison slammed his hand on the pew. "That's exactly what you should have done. Let nature take its course. Then we are no better than the savages you claim to stand against." Margaret shot back. "If we abandon children to die, What separates us from beasts? Reverend Holbrook stood slowly. Margaret saw Catherine grip his arm, but he shook her off. The Lord commands us to love our neighbors, he said carefully. But these heathens are not our neighbors. They are our enemies, and the Bible is clear about— "Suffer the little children to come unto me," Margaret interrupted. Did Christ specify which children? Did he say only the white ones, only the Christian ones? The Reverend's face flushed. Do not presume to lecture me on Scripture, woman. Then perhaps you should reread it yourself, Margaret said evenly. Starting with the Good Samaritan. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some approving, most disapproving. Judge Patterson hammered for silence again. The issue at hand, the judge said, is not theology but public safety. Mrs. Sullivan, can you guarantee these children pose no threat to our community? Before Margaret could answer, Jake Morrison spoke again. She can't guarantee anything. She's already proven where her loyalties lie. Apache bucks coming and going from her property, bringing her supplies. For all we know, she's become one of their women. The insinuation hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice level. Joseph has brought supplies for the children. Yes, food and water when we were desperate. If that makes me a traitor, then I wear the label proudly. You admit it then, Morrison crowed. You consort with hostiles. I accept help for starving children, Margaret corrected, from the only source willing to provide it, since this Christian community turned its back, because you made yourself our enemy. A woman called out, Mrs. Patterson, the judge's wife. You chose them over us. I chose mercy over hatred, Margaret replied. I chose life over death. If that makes me your enemy, the failing is yours, not mine. Enough. Judge Patterson looked weary. Mrs. Sullivan, this community has legitimate concerns. The Apache wars have taken many lives. People are frightened. I understand that, Margaret said more gently. But punishing children for the sins of their elders solves nothing. It only perpetuates the cycle of hatred. Pretty words, Jake Morrison sneered. But they won't bring back the dead. They won't protect us when our Apache friends decide we're easy pickings. It was then that little Sam, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, began to cry. Not the wail of a tantrum, but the frightened whimper of a child who sensed danger. Nayeli immediately scooped him up, murmuring soothing words in Apache. The sight seemed to inflame the crowd further. See, someone shouted. They're speaking their heathen tongue right here in God's house. It's the only language they know, Margaret protested. Then they got no business here. Morrison declared, This is America. We speak English. We worship the Christian God. We don't coddle the spawn of murderers. Ayanna, who had been learning English with remarkable speed, suddenly stepped forward. In careful, accented words, she spoke. My father was good man. He hunt. He protect family. Soldiers come. He fight. That make him bad? You fight for your family too. That make you bad. The room fell silent again, shocked to hear the Apache child speak. Jake Morrison recovered first. You see? Already she defends her savage kin. What'll she be defending in 10 years? Whose scalp will she be taking? Stop it! The voice that rang out surprised everyone, including Margaret. Catherine Holbrook was on her feet, face flushed with anger. Stop this hatred. These are children. Look at them. Look at their faces. Do you see murderers, or do you see scared little ones who need our protection? Sit down, woman, her husband ordered coldly. No, Samuel, I will not. Catherine's voice shook but held firm. I've been silent too long. We all have. We sit in this church every Sunday and nod along to sermons about love and compassion, then walk outside and practice hatred. It's hypocrisy, and I'm sick of it. Catherine, Judge Patterson warned. This is not the place. Where else then? Catherine demanded. When else? When they're dragging Margaret and these babies from their home? When we're washing blood from our hands and telling ourselves it was God's will? The woman's hysterical, Jake Morrison said dismissively. This is what comes of letting females make decisions about. He was cut off by a commotion at the church door. Everyone turned to see Eduardo Santana enter, followed by 3 other Mexican families from the outskirts of town. They rarely attended town meetings, knowing they were barely tolerated themselves. "Forgive the intrusion," Eduardo said formally. "But we could not stay silent. Mrs. Sullivan helped my Maria when she was sick last winter. Asked nothing in return. She is good woman. These children harm no one." "You would say that." Morrison spat. "Mexicans and Indians, all the same." Eduardo's eyes flashed dangerously. "Perhaps, but we know what it is to be hated for our blood, and we know wrong when we see it." Judge Patterson hammered his gavel repeatedly. "Order. We'll have order." The meeting was descending into chaos. Voices raised on all sides, some calling for Margaret's expulsion, others, a growing minority, defending her. Through it all, Margaret stood quietly, her arms around the children who pressed close to her. Finally, the judge managed to restore enough quiet to speak. "It's clear this issue divides our community deeply. Therefore, I propose a compromise. Mrs. Sullivan may continue to care for these children, but under strict conditions. She must not venture into town except for dire emergencies. The children must not leave her property. Any Apache visitors must be reported to the sheriff immediately. And at the first sign of trouble, any trouble, this arrangement ends." "That's not enough," Jake Morrison protested. "It's what I'm ruling," Patterson said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer I write to the federal marshal about last month's attempted arson. I'm sure he'd be very interested in mob violence against women and children." Morrison subsided, though his glare promised this wasn't over. Margaret spoke up. "Your Honor, how am I to get supplies if I can't come to town?" Patterson looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure arrangements can be made. I'll bring what's needed." Catherine said immediately, "And I won't be the only one." She looked around the room defiantly. Then it settled. Patterson banged his gavel. "This meeting is adjourned." The crowd dispersed slowly, many casting dark looks at Margaret as they passed. Jake Morrison paused beside her, speaking low so only she could hear. "This ain't over, not by a long shot. You've made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences." He stalked out, followed by his supporters. Soon only Margaret, the children, and a few allies remained. The Holbrooks, Eduardo and his group, and, surprisingly, Doc Winters, the elderly physician who'd stayed silent throughout but now approached Margaret. "Bring the children by my office tomorrow," he said gruffly. "After hours, I'll examine them. Make sure they're healthy, no charge." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Winters, Don't make a fuss about it," he interrupted. "I took an oath to do no harm. Seems to me letting children suffer would violate that oath." He shuffled away before she could thank him properly. As they prepared to leave, Ayanna tugged on Margaret's sleeve. "We go home now?" "Yes, sweetheart, we go home. They hate us," Ayanna said quietly. "Why you keep us? Why you fight for us?" Margaret knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "Because the love is stronger than hate. Always. It may not seem like it today, but love always wins in the end." Ayanna studied her solemnly, then nodded. "You are true mother. Not born mother, but true mother." The simple words broke through Margaret's composure. She pulled the girl into a fierce embrace, then gathered all 5 children close. They left the church together, walking through the hostile town with heads high. Margaret knew the battle was far from over. Jake Morrison would continue his campaign against them. The danger would only grow. But she'd gained something precious today. Allies willing to stand up and be counted. Catherine Holbrook's courage had surprised everyone, including herself. Eduardo Santana and his people had risked their own precarious position to support her. Even Doc Winters had chosen compassion over prejudice. As they climbed into their wagon for the journey home, Margaret looked back at the town one last time. Somewhere in those buildings, hatred festered and plotted. But somewhere else, in quiet corners and conflicted hearts, love was beginning to take root. The war between those two forces was far from over. But today, in this small skirmish, love had held its ground. For Margaret and her 5 adopted children, that was victory enough. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, but also beautiful in its stark honesty. As they headed home, Sam began to sing, a tuneless child's babble that made his sisters laugh. The sound carried across the empty land, a tiny declaration of joy in a world that seemed determined to stamp it out. Margaret let the reins rest loose in her hands, trusting the old mare to find her way home. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge of trials to come, but also strangely light. She'd stood before her community and declared herself. There was no going back now. But then, she thought, looking at the 5 small heads bobbing with the wagon's movement, she'd crossed that bridge the moment she'd given water to a dying child. Everything since had simply been the living out of that first crucial choice. Love always wins in the end, she'd told Ayanna. Now she had to prove it true, against all odds, against all opposition. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret Sullivan, widow, mother to 5 Apache children, social pariah, an unlikely warrior for love, drove her small family home through the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they would be together, safe in their small house, bound by something stronger than blood or race or the artificial barriers humans erected between themselves. Tonight, love would be enough. The weeks following the town meeting brought an unexpected peace to Margaret's household. The children thrived despite their isolation. And Sam, no longer the silent, solemn toddler, had become a chattering whirlwind who followed his older sisters everywhere. His favorite was still Nayeli, but he'd grown especially attached to Margaret, calling her Mama in his lilting mix of Apache and English. It was a crisp November morning when Joseph appeared again, this time in broad daylight. Margaret was teaching Ayanna to read from the Bible, the only book she had. When she saw him approaching, he rode slowly, hands visible, clearly meaning no alarm. "You're taking a risk coming in daylight," Margaret said as he dismounted. "Some risks are necessary." His dark eyes moved over the children, who had run out to greet him. Sam toddled forward on unsteady legs, and Joseph's weathered face softened as he scooped up the boy. "He grows strong," Joseph observed, speaking to Sam in Apache. The boy responded enthusiastically, his chubby hands gesturing as he babbled. "He tells me you are good mother, that you sing to him when the night brings bad dreams." Margaret felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "He's had nightmares. About what happened to his mother, I think." Joseph nodded gravely, setting Sam down. The boy immediately ran to Margaret, wrapping his arms around her skirts. Children remember more than we think, but also, they heal faster than we do. He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I come with purpose today." "Oh?" "The children need to learn their mother's ways alongside your ways. They are Apache. This will not change, no matter how well they speak English or read your Bible." He gestured to a bundle on his horse. "I bring things to help. And request." Margaret tensed slightly. "What kind of request?" "To visit regular, to teach them songs, stories, the words of our people. They should not grow up empty of who they are." It was a reasonable request, but Margaret knew the danger it posed. "The town is already looking for any excuse to take them from me. If they learn you're coming regularly, then we are careful. Early morning, like now, or after dark." Joseph's expression was earnest. "These children are last of my brother's line. If they forget their people, it is like they die twice." Margaret looked at the 5 faces watching her. Ayanna's hopeful, the others curious. How could she deny them their heritage? "All right, but we must be very careful." Relief flickered across Joseph's features. He unpacked his bundle, beaded leather pouches for each child, containing items of significance. For Ayanna, a bone sewing awl that had belonged to her grandmother. For the twins, matching silver bracelets. For Nayeli, a small painted drum. And for Sam, a boy's first bow, tiny but functional. The children received their gifts with reverence, understanding their importance even without words. Then Joseph sat cross-legged on the ground and began to speak in Apache, his voice taking on the cadence of storytelling. The children gathered around him like flowers turning towards sun, even little Sam growing still and attentive. Margaret watched from the doorway, seeing her adopted children in a new light, in their shabby Anglo clothes, speaking broken English. They could almost pass for what the town wanted them to become. But listening to Joseph's stories, their faces alive with recognition and belonging, they were purely Apache. The lesson continued for nearly 2 hours. Joseph taught them a traditional song, corrected their pronunciation of certain words, and showed the older girls how to hold the sewing awl properly. With Sam, he was especially gentle, teaching the boy to hold the little bow, though he was far too young to use it. As the sun climbed higher, Joseph prepared to leave. But first, he approached Margaret. "I must speak truth," he said quietly. "My people move north for winter. Military pushes hard. Many bands already crossed into Mexico. I may not return for many months." Margaret felt an unexpected pang. "The children will miss you, and I them." He hesitated, then added, "I leave something with you, for protection." From his saddlebag, he withdrew an army Colt revolver and a box of ammunition. Margaret stepped back instinctively. "I can't. Thomas's rifle is enough." "Rifle is good for distance. This is for close, for when they come to your door." His expression was grave. "And they will come. Margaret Sullivan, the hate in that man Morrison, it does not sleep." Margaret slowly took the weapon, surprised by its weight. "I don't even know how to use it." "Then learn. Your life, children's lives, may depend." He showed her the basics. How to load, aim, fire. Her hands shook at first, but steadied under his patient instruction. As he mounted to leave, Joseph paused. "You asked once why I help. I tell you now. My woman who died, she was white, captured as child, raised Apache. She chose to stay, chose me, even when soldiers offered to rescue her. She used to say that family is not blood only, is choice. You choose these children. This makes you more their mother than birth alone could." He rode away before Margaret could respond, leaving her standing in the yard with a loaded revolver and a heart full of conflicting emotions. She'd felt something during his visit, a connection she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was ready to examine. The children waved until Joseph disappeared into the desert haze, then returned to examining their gifts. Ayanna approached Margaret shyly. "A good man," she said in careful English. "Like father, like Thomas." Margaret finished gently. "Yes, he's a good man." That evening, as Margaret prepared supper, she noticed the children playing differently. They incorporated Apache words into their games, sang the song Joseph had taught them. Sam marched around with his little bow, mimicking a hunt. It filled the house with new life, but also reminded Margaret of the tightrope they walked. 3 days later, that tightrope began to fray. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke, not the wood smoke of a cooking fire, but the acrid stench of burning hay. She rushed outside to find her small barn ablaze, the few remaining bales of winter feed sending up pillars of black smoke. The children tumbled out behind her, Sam crying in fear. Margaret pushed them back. "Stay inside! Ayanna, take them to the cellar!" She ran for the well, knowing it was futile. The barn was fully engulfed. Instead, she focused on keeping the fire from spreading to the house, dousing the nearest wall repeatedly. By dawn, only charred timbers remained of the barn. Margaret stood among the ashes, exhausted and covered in soot. Without the barn, her old mare had no shelter for winter. Without the hay, she had no feed. A glint of metal caught her eye. She bent and retrieved it, a belt buckle, distinctive in its design. She'd seen it before. On one of Jake Morrison's men, rage filled her, hot and pure. They'd been careful to strike when she couldn't prove anything, but their message was clear. This was only the beginning. Catherine Holbrook arrived at midday with her weekly supplies, gasping at the destruction. "Oh, Margaret, what happened?" "What do you think happened?" Margaret's voice was bitter. "Morrison's trying to starve us out." Catherine's face hardened. "That evil man. Something must be done." "What? Report it to the sheriff who answers to him? Appeal to the town that wants us gone?" Margaret shook her head. "No, Catherine. This is the war I chose when I took in these children." They were interrupted by approaching horses. Margaret tensed, but relaxed slightly when she saw Doc Winters and, surprisingly, two other men from town, Charles Benson, the banker, and Matthew Frost, who owned the lumber mill. "Mrs. Sullivan," Benson tipped his hat. "We heard about your barn." Margaret waited warily. "Thing is," Frost said, shifting uncomfortably, "some of us have been talking. What's happening here ain't right. Children are children, no matter their blood." Doc Winters spoke up. "What these men are trying to say is, we'd like to help rebuild your barn. Quiet-like. No need for Morrison to know who helped." Margaret felt tears threaten. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Benson advised. "Not charity. Ma'am, justice. Morrison's gone too far, and some of us are tired of being led by fear." They spent the afternoon planning. Frost would supply lumber lost from inventory. Benson would arrange for hay from a contact outside town. Doc Winters knew some Mexican laborers who'd work for fair wages and keep quiet. As the men prepared to leave, Charles Benson lingered. "Ma'am, I knew your husband. Good man. He'd be proud of what you're doing here." He paused. "My own daughter died of fever 3 years back. Would have been about that one's age." He nodded toward Nayeli. "I'd like to think someone would have helped her, if she'd needed it." After they left, Margaret sat with Catherine on the porch, watching the children play in the yard despite the smell of smoke still lingering. "It's starting," Catherine said quietly. "The town's dividing. Morrison's pushed too hard, and people are beginning to push back. Or it could make things worse." Margaret replied, "Cornered animals are the most dangerous." That night, she taught herself to use Joseph's revolver properly, firing at targets in the fading light while the children watched from the porch. Each shot felt like a declaration. She would not be driven out. She would not abandon these children. Sam toddled over when she finished, raising his toy bow. "Me too, Mama. Me fight bad men." She scooped him up, holding him close. "No, little warrior. Your job is to grow strong and smart and kind. Leave the fighting to me." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret wondered how long she could shield them from the violence threatening to consume their small haven. The barn burning was an escalation. Morrison was testing her limits, seeing how far he could push before she broke. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another. The desert was full of predators. Margaret reflected. Some walked on 4 legs, others on 2, but she'd faced down both kinds now and survived. She carried Sam inside, the revolver a comfortable weight on her hip. Tomorrow, men would come to raise a new barn, an act of defiance disguised as charity. After that, who knew what Morrison would try? But tonight, her children were fed and safe. Joseph's gifts had given them joy and connection to their heritage. Unexpected allies had emerged from the hostile town. It wasn't much against the forces arrayed against them, but it was something. As she tucked Sam into the bed he shared with his sisters, he spoke sleepily in Apache, words she didn't understand but recognized from Joseph's stories. Then he switched to English. "Love you, Mama." "Love you too, little one," she whispered. Yes, Margaret thought, checking the locks and placing the revolver within reach. Love was still winning, one small victory at a time. But the war was far from over, and the battles ahead would test that love in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the lingering scent of smoke. Winter was coming to the desert, and with it, Margaret feared, would come the coldest test of all. The night they came for the children was moonless and cold. December had arrived with bitter winds that cut through the thin walls of Margaret's house. She'd been restless all evening, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The children sensed it too. Even Sam was subdued, clinging to Nayeli instead of his usual energetic play. It was past midnight when she heard them. Horses, many horses, moving with deliberate stealth. Margaret was on her feet instantly, Joseph's revolver in her hand. She shook Ayanna awake. "Take them to the cellar," she whispered urgently. "The hidden room. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Ayanna's eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded, already reaching for Sam. Within moments, all 5 children had vanished into the secret space that had saved them before. Margaret had barely dropped the rug back in place when the door exploded inward. Jake Morrison stood there with 15 men, all armed, their faces masked with bandanas. But she knew them, knew their stances, their builds, the hate in their eyes. "Where are they?" Morrison demanded, not bothering with pretense. "Get out of my house." Margaret raised the revolver, proud that her hand remained steady. Morrison laughed. "You gonna shoot all of us, widow?" "I don't think so." He nodded to his men. "Tear it apart." They swarmed through her small home like locusts, overturning furniture, ripping apart bedding, smashing her few precious belongings. Margaret stood frozen, gun still raised, knowing that firing would only give them excuse to kill her. "Check the cellar," Morrison barked. Her heart stopped. But the men who descended returned, shaking their heads. "Nothing but preserves. Boss, check again. They're here somewhere." It was then that fate intervened in the form of hoofbeats. Lots of them. Approaching fast, Morrison's men scrambled to the windows. "Riders coming. Looks like law." For a wild moment, Margaret hoped Judge Patterson had somehow learned of the raid. But the riders who materialized from the darkness weren't lawmen. They were Apache warriors, Joseph at their head. And with them rode an unexpected sight. Catherine Holbrook, still in her nightdress with a coat thrown over, Doc Winters, Charles Benson, and a dozen other townspeople. "Stand down. Morrison." Judge Patterson's voice rang out. So he had come after all. "This is an illegal assembly engaged in criminal trespass." "We're making a citizen's arrest," Morrison shouted back. "This woman is harboring enemies of—" His words cut off as Joseph and his warriors spread out, effectively surrounding the house. They didn't raise weapons, but their presence was threat enough. The townspeople, meanwhile, had formed their own line, creating a bizarre standoff. Apache and townspeople united against Morrison's mob. "Jake Morrison," Judge Patterson announced formally, "I hereby arrest you for breaking and entering, destruction of property, and leading a vigilante action. Men, drop your weapons or share his fate." "You're taking the side of savages over your own kind," Morrison snarled. It was Catherine who answered, pushing forward on her horse. "We're taking the side of law and human decency. Something you've forgotten, if you ever knew it." The standoff stretched taut. Morrison's men looked between their leader, the judge, the Apache warriors, and the armed townspeople. Slowly, one by one, they began lowering their guns. "Cowards!" Morrison spat, but he was beaten and knew it. He turned to Margaret, his eyes burning with hatred. "This ain't over, not by a long shot. You've corrupted this whole town with your Indian-loving ways. But justice will come. Count on it." Judge Patterson motioned to several men he'd deputized. "Take him to the jail. The rest of you scatter. Now, I see any of you near this property again. You'll join him." The mob dispersed into the night, leaving Margaret standing in her wrecked home, still clutching the revolver. It was only when the last of them had gone that her knees buckled. Joseph was there instantly, steadying her. "How did you know?" she asked weakly. "Catherine," he said simply. "She rode to our camp. Brave woman. Said she overheard plan at town meeting." Catherine dismounted, rushing to embrace Margaret. "When Samuel came home talking about teaching you all a lesson tonight, I knew I had to act. I slipped out and rode first to the judge. Then, well, I remembered Joseph saying he'd camp near Skeleton Ridge. Thank God I found him." Doc Winters was already heading for the cellar. "Let's get those children out. They must be terrified." Margaret called softly in the darkness. and slowly, the hidden door opened. Ayanna peered out first, then, seeing safety, helped the others emerge. Sam was crying silently, his little body shaking with suppressed sobs. Margaret dropped to her knees and gathered all 5 children into her arms. They clung to her, and she felt their tears soaking through her nightgown. "It's over," she whispered. "You're safe. We're all safe. For now," Joseph said quietly. Judge Patterson approached, looking older than his years. "Mrs. Sullivan, I must apologize. I've let this situation deteriorate shamefully. Morrison will stand trial, but—" He shook his head. "His poison runs deep in this town. I can't guarantee your safety. Then we'll guarantee it ourselves." Charles Benson spoke up. "I propose we form a protection committee. Take turns watching the property. I'll help." Matthew Frost added. "My mill workers, too. Lots of them have no love for Morrison." More voices joined in. Eduardo Santana, the other Mexican families, even some Margaret didn't recognize. In the space of minutes, an informal alliance had formed. Joseph watched this with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke. "My people go south for winter soon, but some warriors stay. We watch too. Anyone comes to harm these children answers to us." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Judge Patterson looked uncomfortable but didn't object. As the crowd began to disperse, Joseph lingered. The children, recognizing their protector, swarmed him with hugs. Even Sam toddled over, raising his arms to be lifted. Joseph obliged, speaking softly to the boy in Apache. "You fought well tonight," he told Margaret. "Like warrior." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Fear and courage are brothers. One cannot exist without other." He set Sam down, then reached into his pouch. "I have something. Was waiting for right time." He withdrew a small silver cross on a leather cord, clearly not Apache work. "This was my woman's. She wore it always. Said it protected her. I think she would want you to have it." Margaret's throat tightened as he placed it around her neck. The gesture felt significant, weighted with meaning neither of them spoke aloud. "Joseph, No words needed." He touched her face gently, a butterfly-light brush of fingers. Some things do not require words. He left then, melting into the darkness with his warriors. Margaret stood in her ruined doorway, one hand on the cross, the other holding Sam, who had refused to let go of her skirts. Catherine helped her clean up the worst of the damage while Doc Winters examined each child to ensure they were unharmed. As dawn broke, painting the desert in soft pastels, an exhausted Margaret finally had a moment to reflect on the night's events. "Everything's changed," she said to Catherine, who was sweeping broken glass. "Yes," her friend agreed. "The masks are off now. Everyone's chosen their side. Morrison won't give up. He'll be more dangerous now." "Humiliated and cornered?" Catherine paused in her sweeping. "Perhaps, but look what else has changed. Apache and townspeople standing together. Who would have imagined that 6 months ago? It was true. The alliance was fragile, born of crisis. But it existed. The children had brought together people who should have been enemies, united them in protection of innocence. Ayanna approached shyly. "Miss Margaret, we make breakfast? For helpers?" Margaret smiled, exhausted but touched. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's feed our friends." As the children bustled about, preparing what food they had to share, Margaret noticed how they'd changed. The terror of the night had aged them. Yes, but also strengthened their bond. They moved like a unit now, each anticipating the other's needs. Sam shadowed Ayanna, trying to help despite his age. The twins worked in perfect synchronization. Nayli hummed as she worked, one of Joseph's songs. Judge Patterson returned as they were serving simple fare to those who'd remained. "Mrs. Sullivan, a word." They stepped aside, and he continued grimly. "Morrison's supporters are already agitating for his release. I can hold him perhaps a week on current charges. After that," he spread his hands helplessly. "I understand." "Do you?" He'll come back harder, and next time, we might not get warning." Margaret touched the cross at her throat, drawing strength from it. "Then we'll be ready, all of us." The judge studied her, this widow who'd become an unlikely catalyst for change. "You've started something here, ma'am. Where it ends, God only knows." After he left, Margaret found herself surrounded by her strange new alliance: Mexican families, Apache watchers in the distance, townspeople who'd finally found their conscience, and at the center, 5 children who'd lost everything but found love. Sam tugged at her skirts. "Mama sad." She lifted him up, breathing in his little boy scent. "No, baby, Mama's not sad. Mama's grateful." And she was. Despite the terror of the night, despite the uncertainty ahead, she was grateful. They'd stood at the precipice of disaster and pulled back. The community that had seemed uniformly against her had revealed its hidden hearts. Joseph had shown depths of feeling that thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The sun climbed higher, warming the December air. In the new barn, built by secret hands in defiance of hatred, her old mare nickered for attention. The children laughed at something Ayanna said. Catherine and Doc Winters debated the best treatment for winter coughs. Life went on. Margaret realized, changed, charged with new danger and new possibility. But continuing nonetheless, Morrison would return, full of vengeance. But he'd return to find not a lone widow with stolen children, but a community that had rediscovered its soul. "Come," she told the children. "Let's clean our house and make it strong again. We have much work to do." As they set about restoring order from chaos, Margaret felt the weight of the revolver still at her hip, the cool touch of silver at her throat, and the warm presence of 5 small souls who'd become her entire world. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The desert wind whispered through the damaged door, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Somewhere out there. Joseph and his warriors kept watch. In town, new alliances were forming, old prejudices crumbling, and in a small house at the edge of nowhere, a family forged by circumstance rather than blood prepared for whatever battles lay ahead. The night had been dark, but morning had come, and with it, hope that love might yet triumph over hate. The spring of 1874 arrived with unexpected gentleness, painting the desert in brilliant wildflowers and filling the air with the scent of renewal. Margaret stood in her doorway, watching the children play in the yard. They'd grown so much, Ayanna, now 8, had become her invaluable helper. Natalie mothered everyone, especially Sam, who at nearly 3 was a bundle of energy and mischief. The twins had developed distinct personalities, Soyala quiet and thoughtful, Kaya bold and adventurous. It had been 3 months since Jake Morrison's release from jail. He'd left town immediately after, but Margaret knew better than to believe he was gone for good. The threat hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. But today, with Joseph visiting openly in daylight, a testament to how much had changed, she allowed herself to feel hope. "They speak good English now," Joseph observed, watching Sam chatter to his sisters in a mix of both languages. "And good Apache." Margaret replied, "Thanks to you." They stood companionably, a comfortable silence between them that had grown over the months. Joseph's visits had become regular, no longer just about the children. He helped with repairs, brought game when hunting was good, and gradually, carefully, had become part of their strange family. "Margaret," he said suddenly, his voice carrying unusual weight, "I must speak something." She turned to find him looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "What is it?" "My people leave soon, south to Mexico, where soldiers cannot follow. Is safer there." He paused, struggling with words. I wish for you and children to come." Margaret's breath caught. "Joseph, I know is much to ask. Leave your land, your people, but here," he gestured to the house, "still bearing scorch marks from the fire attempts. Here is always danger. There, children can be Apache without fear, can grow strong, proud of who they are. And you?" she asked softly. "What are you asking for yourself?" His weathered face softened. "I ask for family, For woman who has warrior heart to stand beside me, for children to raise as my own. He touched her face gently. I ask for you. Margaret Sullivan, if you will have Apache man who brings nothing but strong hands and full heart. Margaret felt tears blur her vision. Over the months, she'd come to care deeply for this man who'd shown such kindness, such dignity in the face of hatred, but this is their home too, she said, gesturing to the children. The only one Sam has ever known, and I have allies here now, people who've risked much to support us. Joseph nodded slowly. I understand, but offer stands. Until we leave, offer stands. Before Margaret could respond, Ayanna came running. Riders coming! Many riders! Margaret's hand went to a revolver, but Joseph was already moving, positioning himself between the approaching dust cloud and the children. Then Ayanna called out again. His friends, Mrs., Catherine, Doctor. Indeed, it was their allies, but riding hard, faces grim. Judge Patterson was with them, along with Charles Benson and several others. They reined up in a cloud of dust. Morrison's back, the judge said without preamble. Brought hired guns from Texas. They're planning something for tonight. Margaret's blood ran cold. How do you know? Eduardo's cousin heard them talking at the Mexican cantina. They're drunk and careless. Doc Winters looked angry. They mean to finish what they started. Margaret, all of it. How many? Joseph asked quietly. 20, maybe more. Judge Patterson looked exhausted. I've sent for the federal marshal, but he won't arrive for days. Then we fight, Joseph said simply. My warriors are near. We protect what is ours. Our fight too, Catherine said firmly. I'm tired of living in fear of that man. As plans were hurriedly made, Margaret made a decision. She called Ayanna over. Take your brothers and sisters to the hidden room. Take food, water, blankets. You may be there a long time. No, Sam protested, understanding enough. Stay with Mama. Margaret knelt, pulling him close. Listen to me, little warrior. Your job is to protect your sisters. Can you do that for Mama? His little face scrunched with the effort not to cry, but he nodded. Be brave like Papa Joseph. The casual use of the title made Joseph's eyes widen, but there was no time to address it. The children were quickly hidden away, and preparations began for siege. As the sun began its descent, Margaret found herself checking weapons alongside unlikely allies. Catherine, who'd never held a gun, grimly loaded rifles. Doc Winters prepared medical supplies. Mexican vaqueros took positions alongside Apache warriors. It was, Margaret thought, either humanity at its best or a recipe for disaster. Joseph appeared at her side. I ask again, he said quietly. After tonight, whatever comes, leave with me. Make new life where children can be free. This time. Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered. If we survive this, yes. His face transformed with joy, but there was no time for more. The watchman's whistle announced Morrison's approach. They came as the last light faded, a dark line of riders, no longer bothering with stealth. Morrison led them, his face twisted with hate even at a distance. They stopped just outside rifle range. Last chance, Indian lover. Morrison's voice carried clearly. Send out those brats and we'll let you live. Margaret stood on her porch, flanked by Joseph and Judge Patterson. The only thing I'm sending you, Morrison, is a promise. Touch these children, and you'll answer to all of us. Morrison laughed harshly. All of you. A bunch of Mexicans, Indian lovers, and savages? You think that scares me? It should. Judge Patterson called out. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Ride away now, and you might live. I don't think so. Judge, see, I brought some law of my own. Morrison produced a paper. Bounty warrants. Seems those Apache brats are wanted for questioning about raids their daddy might have been part of. Legal-like? So stand aside, or you're obstructing justice. It was a lie, but a clever one. In the uncertain light, Margaret saw some of her allies waver. Bounty warrants gave Morrison's actions a veneer of legality. Those children were babies when their parents died. Doc Winters shouted. "This is murder disguised as law. Prove it in court." Morrison sneered. "After we take them in for questioning, course, Apache brats trying to escape. Well, accidents happen." The threat was clear. Margaret felt rage build in her chest, pure, righteous fury at this man who would murder children and call it justice. "No," she said, her voice carrying with surprising strength. "No more. You want these children? Come and take them. But you'll go through me first. Through all of us. And Jake Morrison. I promise you this, you won't live to see another sunset." The standoff stretched taut. Then Morrison raised his hand, and his men began to advance. "If you want them, come and take them," Margaret shouted, raising her rifle. The battle erupted with shocking violence. Gunfire split the night, muzzle flashes like deadly fireworks. Margaret fired and reloaded with mechanical precision. All of Thomas's patient teaching coming back. Beside her, Joseph worked his rifle with deadly efficiency. Morrison's men had expected easy prey. Instead, they faced determined resistance from all sides. Apache arrows found marks in the darkness. Vaqueros who'd grown up fighting bandits proved their skill. Even Catherine, terrified but resolute, fired from a window. But Morrison's men were killers too. One of the vaqueros fell. Then another. Doc Winters dragged wounded to safety, working frantically. The barn caught fire again, this time successfully, flames leaping into the night sky. In the chaos, Margaret lost track of Morrison himself. Then she heard it, splintering wood from the back of the house. He'd circled around, trying for the children while others fought. She ran, Joseph beside her. They burst into the kitchen to find Morrison prying at the cellar door with a crowbar, 2 men covering him. "It's over, Morrison," Margaret said, both guns trained on him. He turned, his face demonic in the firelight from outside. "Nothing's over till those spawn are dead, till you're dead, till every Indian-loving—" The shot came from outside. Catherine, of all people, standing in the doorway with a smoking rifle. Morrison looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. Surprise replacing hatred. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Catherine said coldly. "I think that applies to child killers too." Morrison fell, his grand crusade ending in blood on Margaret's kitchen floor. His remaining men, seeing their leader down, broke and ran. The battle was over as suddenly as it had begun. In the aftermath, as Doc Winters tended wounded and the barn fire was brought under control, Margaret retrieved the children. They emerged wide-eyed but unharmed. Sam immediately attaching himself to her skirts. "Is it over?" Ayanna asked in a small voice. Margaret looked at Morrison's body being carried away, at her friends and allies bloodied but victorious, at Joseph standing protective beside them all. "Yes, sweetheart, it's finally over." Judge Patterson, nursing a grazed arm, approached. "There'll be an inquiry, but with dozens of witnesses. Justified defense, clear as day. Morrison's reign of terror is finished," as dawn broke, painting the battlefield in gentler colors. Margaret stood with Joseph watching the sunrise. The children played nearby, resilient as always, while their protectors cleaned up the nighttime's violence. "My offer," Joseph said quietly. "You said yes. Did you mean it?" Margaret took his hand, feeling its strength and gentleness combined. "I meant it, but not running to Mexico. We've earned our place here, fought for it, bled for it." She looked at him steadily. "Stay. Help me raise these children in both worlds. Show this town that love is stronger than hate." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You ask much. Apache man living in white woman's world. Many will not accept. Some won't." Margaret agreed. "But look around. More will than won't. We've already proven that." He squeezed her hand. "Then I stay. We make new path. You and I. For children. For future." As if summoned, Sam toddled over, raising his arms to Joseph. "Up, Papa." Joseph lifted him, and Sam immediately began chattering about the bad man's and how he'd protected his sisters. Margaret watched them, this Apache warrior and the small boy who'd claimed him as father, and felt her heart overflow. Ayana approached shyly. "Miss Margaret, are we staying? Forever?" "Yes, my dear one. We're staying. This is our home. All of us." The girl's face lit up. She ran to tell her sisters, and soon all 5 children were dancing in the morning light, a celebration of survival and belonging. Catherine approached, still pale from her first kill but resolute. "I've been thinking. These children need proper schooling. I'm going to start a school. For all children, Apache, Mexican, white, together. That's a beautiful dream," Margaret said. "Dreams become real when we fight for them." Catherine replied, "You taught me that." As the sun climbed higher, warming the battle-scarred earth, Margaret Sullivan stood surrounded by her family, 5 Apache children who called her mother, an Apache man who'd won her heart, and a community that had found its courage. The desert bloomed around them, cacti flowers opening to the new day. It had been a long, dangerous journey from that first desperate morning when she'd found 4 starving children. But love had indeed won. Not easily, not without cost, but definitively. "Come," Joseph said, shifting Sam to one arm and offering Margaret the other. "Let us go home." Home. Yes, Margaret thought, gathering her children close. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, this unlikely family had found their home, and they would defend it, nurture it, and fill it with love for all the years to come. The battle was over. The war was won. And in the vast, unforgiving desert, love had carved out a place where Apache and white, Mexican and Anglo, could simply be family. As they walked together toward their battered but standing house, Margaret felt Thomas's presence like a blessing. He would have understood. He would have been proud. And somewhere in the distant mountains, she thought she heard the desert itself singing, a song of endurance, of courage, of love that transcends all boundaries. The end. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. Where are you enjoying this story from? Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret's incredible journey. Your support means the world to us.